welcome back to my corner of the internet. I'm Shannon, and today I've got another book talk video to share with you guys, and today we are talking about The Unforgotten by Laura Powell. I picked up this book kind of on a whim. A week or so ago I was in Walmart, saw it, thought the cover was pretty, and the blurb on the back sounded interesting. So what we've got here is a bit of a murder mystery. It takes place, the bulk of the story takes place in 1956, and then we get some jump aheads to present day. So at the beginning, we're reading from two different perspectives. The 1956 story is told from Betty's perspective. Betty is 15 years old. She lives in a small seaside town in England, and she runs an inn there with her mother. And when we first meet her, you know, she's your typical 15-year-old, worried about typical 15-year-old things like the boys that she likes in town, her friends, things like that. But then on the other hand, we start to see that Betty's kind of got her hands full with her mother, her mom. At first, we're not sure exactly what is going on with her mom, but as the story unfolds, we see that she probably is bipolar, so there's a lot of ups and a lot of downs for Betty with her mom, and some days her mom won't get out of bed. Other days she's, you know, just so full of life, just all-encompassing, big personality, and there doesn't really seem to be a whole lot of middle ground. Then, from the present day, it's told from a woman's perspective, and her name is Mary. So, back to 1956. At the beginning of the book, we realize that there's been a murder. A local girl has been murdered. And this, of course, puts sort of a fear into everyone in this small town. And all of a sudden, a ton of reporters start spilling in to the small town. They're checking into the inn where Betty and her mother work. Because, of course, you know, murder in a small town, that's a big story. So, you know, 5, 10, 15 reporters all of a sudden roll in. So as the story goes on, we're learning more about Betty and her mom, and then another girl ends up dead. And as it's all sort of unfolding, Betty and one of the reporters, he's kind of, he's 30 years old, he's kind of aloof, kind of more disconnected than the others are. The other reporters who are staying at the hotel, you know, they all sit around in the evenings, they have drinks, there's a lot of laughter and camaraderie, but this other reporter, whose name is John Gallagher, he kind of doesn't get involved with that. He's sort of just there to do what he's there to do, and that's it. But as time goes by, we start to see that him and 15-year-old Betty start to sort of form a kinship of sorts. And he starts talking to her a little bit about what's been going on in town, and she starts sharing her thoughts, and he actually ends up getting some good information for her that she later sees in newspaper articles that he's written, and she's kind of like, oh, I didn't know we were talking on the record and things like that. And so the relationship, it just starts to, you know, at first it's just a kinship, and then it turns in a little bit more into like this complicated friendship. So then after a while, we're back to the present day, and this woman named Mary, we can tell, it's sort of set up that, you know, she's older, obviously, because we don't know why or how or who she was at this point, but Mary, we remember, was the name of one of Betty's friends, so we're thinking, okay, so this is Betty's friend now. She's having some health troubles. She's been diagnosed with breast cancer. Her husband and her daughter are just really concerned about her health. She seems to be getting a little bit confused at times. So this one day she goes out on her own, and she gets some groceries, and she goes to some appointments. And then as she's walking home, she sees a headline on a newspaper, and it says like, "The Cornish Cleaver Speaks," or something like that. Like the Cornish Cleaver speaks, or the Cornish Cleaver breaks his silence, or something like that. And then, as we know, from the 1956 portions of the story, the Cornish cleaver was the nickname that had been given to the murderer. And when she sees this headline, she drops her groceries. She's having a very, she's very shocked. She's very upset by this. And we start to hear her thoughts, and she's thinking like, oh my God, like what am I going to do? 50 years ago, I let an innocent man go to prison. And she knew that he was innocent at the time that she let him take the fall for these murders. So we're like, okay, who is he? We're sort of like, okay, we don't really yet know what's going on. Then it goes back to 1956, and like another girl has been murdered. So I think the death toll now is like up to 3. They're all young, pretty girls who just are locals, and everyone knows them. So it's really shaking everyone up. So as she's getting closer, as Betty's getting closer to Gallagher, eventually one night he invites her out for dinner, or to a movie, sorry. And at first she says no, but then eventually she goes, and we're starting to get these weird vibes, and he's starting to get these weird vibes, and he's a little disturbed with himself that he's having these feelings for this 15-year-old girl. And we're sort of inside his head, and he's kind of like, she seems so much older, but still it's a little weird that he's having these feelings for her. And that kind of just, I didn't know that romance, this blossoming romantic feelings really needed to be in the story. I think it still would have played out fairly similarly if they had just left it with a friendship between the two, but as time goes by, they start to get a little bit of romantic feelings happening. So throughout all this, the first man who is suspected of being the Cornish cleaver is the local butcher, and just because he's a little different, he's a little off, and people think that it must be him. But Betty seems to think no, I know it's not him, and how I know it isn't him is that Betty's mom had been seeing him, and so she'd been going to talk to him and whatnot, seeing him many nights. But then the butcher called it off with the mom, but the mom had still been going over every night because she became sort of obsessed with him. And so Betty would have to go searching for her moms in the night, and she'd find her drunk, laying outside this man's house, just crying, passed out, just the whole bit. And that was a bit much. So as time goes by, there's a couple more murders, and then things really hit a fever pitch with Betty and the reporter Gallagher. And one night they're at the beach, and they're getting closer, and then they get intimate, and then all of a sudden he's like, oh no, I have to leave, this was a bad mistake, and he just leaves her on the beach, and she's like, oh, he'll be back for sure, he wouldn't just leave me on the beach, especially when there's a murderer out on the loose. And then through sort of the corner of her eye, she sees a rustling in the trees nearby where they are, and she sees her Sunday school teacher there, and she's kissing a man that she recognizes as one of her classmates' fathers. And she's like, oh, that's weird. And so at first she wants to say something, but then she thinks, no, I should probably just leave. So she leaves, and then later that night, that Sunday school teacher is the next one murdered. And so she is like, oh my God, I know who the murderer is. Clearly it's not this butcher, it's Mr. Paxton, her school friend's father. So she doesn't know what to do with this information. And before Gallagher had just left her in the woods, he made her promise, the whole 9 yards, that she would never breathe a word of what they did to anyone. Because he's 30 years old, she's 50, and he's like, not only would I be arrested, I'd be hanged for this. So she's like, oh my God, clearly I don't want that to happen, so she doesn't mention it. So now it's been like a while since he's left, a while since the Sunday school teacher was murdered, and she writes to him because she knows that he came to their small town from London, where he worked for a major newspaper there. So she writes to the newspaper, like she writes to him, care of the newspaper, telling him that she desperately needs his help, telling him what she saw. And she's starting to get really panicked because more and more heat is going on this butcher, Mr. Forbes. And they're getting ready to arrest him for these murders. But she knows that it wasn't him. So, she, after a while, and she hasn't heard from Mr. Gallagher, she goes into London. She gets on the train, she goes to find him. When she gets to the newspaper there, she's told that he doesn't work there anymore, that all of his mail is being forwarded to his apartment, but of course she can't give her the address. But she can tell her that from what she knows, he's currently overseas. So Betty kind of goes back home feeling really, discouraged, upset. She doesn't know what to do. She's scared to go to the police on her own because she thinks she'll be asked why she was in the woods in the first place, and then she won't know what to say, and she'll get overwhelmed and she'll blurt it out. And she doesn't want to do that because she promised him she would never tell anyone, so she wants him to come and help her figure out a way to tell so that the man who is innocent doesn't get arrested. So at this point, there seems like there's so many people who could have done it. But we're pretty sure at this point that it wasn't Mr. Forbes, and we're thinking it's Mr. Paxton because it seems like the only thing that makes any sense. So it's a great mystery. There's so much that happens. While I was reading the book, I was kind of like, it's fine. I wasn't loving it until I got closer to the end. And so I'm going to tell you about the ending now. So if you do not want any spoilers, now is your chance to click off this video. And I'll thank you for watching. And if you do eventually read it, I'd love to hear what you thought of it. Okay. I think they're gone now. Okay, so what happens is Betty comes home after being away. And she was away overnight. She didn't tell her mother where she was going, so she rushes home. She's sure that she's going to be in big trouble because everyone's probably worried because, of course, the murderer's still on the loose. But she couldn't help it. She had to go. She had to go and try to find him. So when she gets home, there's police and everything at the inn, and she quickly learns that through the night, her mother passed away. She had been drinking, as she often did, during some of her episodes, and she was sick through the night and she choked on it. So that sort of sends Betty into this absolute tailspin. Like, she is, as you would be, she's horrified, and she starts in her hysteria just blurting out, I know who did it. It was Mr. Paxton. We can't let Mr. Forbes go to prison and all this. And she's just hysterical. And because of it, everyone just thinks it's her grief paired with whatever. And instead of listening to her, they actually have her put into a mental institution for a little while, just to sort of help her grieve and help her do whatever else. Meanwhile, in the present day tense, we have Mary, and, so she's been seeing what's going on with the man finally getting out of prison, and she wonders, how can I make this right? And the man who's been in prison for all those years, was Mr. Forbes, and she knows he didn't do it. She knows that Mr. Paxton did it. So we see her leave her husband and her daughter, they're very worried about her, and she goes into the city. And we find out, through listening to her talk to her husband in the more earlier parts of the present day, that he doesn't really know anything about her. She, she'll tell them something, and then we'll get the inner dialogue of, I hate having to lie to them, etc. Then we see her going to the city, and she goes and she finds Mr. Gallagher, the reporter that she had kind of been in love with, who kind of just Betty, who Betty had kind of been in love with. And she goes and she finds him, and he's sort of in a nursing home for people who suffer from dementia, because, you know, he was 30 in 1956, so present day he's quite old. And she goes in, and his nurse is kind of like, he's in and out of it, so, you know, just be patient with him, and you might be able to jog his memory. And so she goes in, and he says, who are you? And he says, Mary. And he's like, I don't know. She says the last name, I think it was like Studgeon. And he said, I don't know anybody by that name. He said, but your face looks really familiar. And he says, oh, how do I know you? Where do I know you? And she tells him that she is Betty, from back in the small town, and she sort of jogs his memory, and then he's just like, get out. You have to get out now. Like, I can't be doing this with you right now. So she leaves. She goes back to the hotel. She finally calls her husband to let him know at least that she's okay, even though she doesn't tell him where she is or why. But she lets him know that she's okay. So we switch back into the past, and it's now from Gallagher's point of view. And we learn that about a month after she had gone to the city looking for him, he returned home from France and found the letter that she had left for him. So he gets in his car and he drives into town, and he goes to the inn, and he knocks on the door, and they're just like, no, you get out of here, you're a reporter, whatever. And he's like, no, I'm not here as a reporter, I'm here looking for Betty or her mother, Dolores. And she said, are you kidding me? Like, get out of here. We are all still in mourning. She's not here. Like, go. So he's got the letter that she had sent him that names Mr. Paxton as the murderer. So he goes to confront Paxton. And he goes to the factory where Paxton works, and he's just yelling. He's like, I know what you did. Come out here and face me. Like, so Paxton comes out, and he sort of fills Gallagher in on what's going on, because the woman at the inn wouldn't. She was too upset. So he tells her, you know, Dolores passed away, and Betty's in a mental institution. And so he's kind of like, oh, okay. He's like, well, I know that you killed those girls because Betty saw you in the woods with one of them. Mr. Paxton is just like, no, you've got it all wrong. Like, you've got it all wrong. It wasn't me that killed them. And Gallagher's like, yeah, okay, like, I've got it in writing. I've got all the proof I need. I'm going to the police, and this is it. And Gallagher, and Paxton says, wait, let me tell you what actually happened. And he's like, I have proof of what actually happened. And so he starts telling us a bit of history between him and Betty's mom, Dolores. He said, you know, I haven't been a good husband. I've often been unfaithful to my wife. And one of those times, it was with Dolores. And he says, she just became obsessed with me, which makes sense to us because we know that Mr. Forbes went through the same thing with Dolores when he broke it off. She became obsessed and wouldn't leave him alone. So Paxton's saying the same thing. And he's like, you know, she'd come to my home, she'd harass me, she'd come to my work, she wouldn't leave me alone. He said, so she was stalking me so much and making me so wary that she was just going to ruin my life. I kind of kept leading her on. You know, sometimes I'd go for a walk with her, or I'd take her for a drive. I wanted to keep her happy enough so that she wasn't stalking me and my family. And he's like, that was a bad idea. I know that now, etc., etc. And so Gallagher's kind of like, yeah, okay, well, what does that have to do with anything? And then Paxton pulls out this letter that Dolores, Betty's mom, had sent to him before she died. And in it, she confesses that she was the killer all along. And Gallagher's like, that doesn't make any sense. And he was like, yeah, well, I had been in the woods with a Sunday school teacher. She was the most recent one that I was seeing. And, you know, Dolores found out somehow and she killed her. And the letter matches up. And at first, you know, Gallagher's like, well, that could be anybody. You could have forged that. But even he himself later admits that, no, the writing looks the same as he had always seen, like, on his bills when he was staying at the hotel, on the menu, on the kitchen wall, things like that. And so Gallagher asks, like, what about all the other girls? Like, you were seeing all of them too? And Paxton's like, no, I hadn't been seeing all of them. Like, some of them were just people who worked in my factory that I was friendly with because they were employees or children of employees. Like, anyone I spoke to that she, you know, perceived of as a threat, she just murdered them. And this letter proves it. So, Gallagher's like, this is insane. We're going to the police with this. We are not letting an innocent man go to prison for something you did. So he goes out to his car and he's thinking, and then he's thinking about Betty, and he's thinking about, like, the ramifications of being the Cornish cleaver's daughter and what that could do to her life. And he gets out of the car and he goes back into the factory and he's like, here's what we're going to do, but it's too late. Mr. Paxton has already ended his own life because of, you know, just the ramifications of what would happen when his family found out about all these girls that he had been with and all of this. And so then truly it comes down to Gallagher's like, okay, well, we'll just leave things as they are. And then Betty can stay in the hospital, and then when she gets out, it's a fresh start, and she's not the daughter of the Cornish cleaver. And he just kind of leaves. And then Mr. Forbes goes to jail for like 20 years until it's found that he's innocent. So truly, Gallagher was the one that let that happen, because he was the one that knew for sure who actually did it. And then as we see Betty marry in the future, Betty was writing Mr. Forbes a letter telling her how sorry she was that he had to pay for her for a crime he didn't commit, and that she had not done more. You know, she said, I tried to tell them that it wasn't you, but they wouldn't listen to me. And then we go back to the future, and Betty's home with her husband. Just the sort of release of grief and guilt that came from writing, even just writing Mr. Forbes that letter and going to see Mr. Gallagher. She's relieved a lot, and she starts to do better. Her health starts to do better because she's not just shackled with so much guilt, even though, you know, she was 15 years old. She didn't do anything wrong. She tried to help. You know, she tried to keep him out of prison. But, you know, still, as you would, she still carried that for her entire life. Then a man shows up at the door, and he identifies himself as Mr. Gallagher's son. And he says, my dad recently passed away, and he left this for you. And, oh, yeah. When the son shows up, Betty isn't there. She's out running errands. The husband's there. And so, you know, he thanks him and takes the package, and then the son leaves, and then a few hours pass, and it gets the best of him, and he can't wait for Betty to get home. He opens it up, and inside of it is a manuscript of a book that the son had been helping the father to write, sort of like a memoir. And Jerry, Betty's husband, takes the book and he throws it in the fire. He's like, we're past this. That's the past now. She's doing better. I don't want this to come and, you know, drag her down and hurt her in any way. So he gets rid of it. But what we see that he didn't notice was, as he chucked the book into the fire, a small envelope fell out, and addressed to it just said, "To my Betty." And then the book's over. So we don't get to know what's in that envelope. I was so wanting to know what final words Gallagher had for Betty, but we don't know. We're never told. And then that's kind of it. So yeah, like I said, while reading the book, my feelings were kind of like, meh. I was dislike it, but it wasn't anything super special to me. I didn't think that it had to be necessary for Betty and Gallagher to have a romance. I think they could have still accomplished what they were going for with a close friendship, and then it wouldn't have crossed the line into that creeper territory where he's 30 years old sleeping with a 15-year-old girl. But that said, I really was pleased when we got to it, and it turned out that Betty's mom was the killer, because I hadn't guessed that. So I liked that she was able to surprise me with that ending, because I don't often get surprised, and when I do, I just love it. I love it. And before we go, I wanted to do a shout out. As always, it's Friday on my channel. I like to share the love and hopefully introduce you guys to a new channel that you'll enjoy. Today's shout out goes to Vicky J. Vicky is an absolute delight. She is drop dead gorgeous. She has a wonderful channel with makeup tutorials, hauls, beauty videos. If you love any of that stuff, definitely go and check her out. She's so supportive. She is so sweet and so kind. You'll absolutely love her. If you go, let her know that I sent you, and I will see you guys tomorrow with another Tea Talk video. Bye guys.